Picture this: April 12, 1945, in the mountains of Baguio, Philippines, where 24 Japanese women knelt together in the mud, their hands pressed in prayer, but they weren't asking to be saved. They were begging for death to come quickly. The sky hung gray and heavy above them, and somewhere in the distance, they could hear American voices getting closer with every passing minute. This was the moment they'd been trained to expect their entire lives, the brutal, terrible end that propaganda had promised them. These women, their hearts pounding with fear, listened as heavy American boots marched toward their compound, each footstep bringing them closer to what they believed would be their final moments. Lieutenant Yoshiko, trying to stay calm, had told the others to face their deaths with dignity as soldiers of the Emperor, but inside, her heart was racing so fast she could barely breathe. The propaganda films she'd watched kept playing in her mind like a nightmare she couldn't escape. Images of American soldiers laughing while they killed prisoners, setting entire villages on fire, showing no mercy to anyone who crossed their path. And then, just like that, the footsteps stopped. The gate to their compound swung open slowly, and the American soldiers walked in, but something was wrong. They weren't carrying rifles or weapons at all. Instead, their arms were full of wooden crates packed with food, medical supplies, and warm blankets. In that single moment, kneeling there in the Philippine mud, these 24 women realized that everything they'd ever been told about their enemy was a complete lie. This story, one that history has almost completely forgotten, reveals something incredibly powerful about war, about propaganda, and about how human kindness can somehow survive even in the darkest moments imaginable. What happened in that small compound over the weeks that followed would completely shatter everything both sides believed about each other, proving that even in the middle of total war, compassion could still find a way to break through. To really understand how these women ended up in that muddy compound expecting to be executed, we need to go back 6 months earlier to October 1944, when General Douglas MacArthur and American forces returned to the Philippines, keeping the famous promise he'd made years before. The Japanese forces who'd been occupying the islands since 1942 were now fighting desperately just to survive, trapped and surrounded. Among the 30,000 Japanese troops scattered across Luzon Island were about 200 women serving as nurses, communications officers, administrative clerks, and managers of comfort stations. Japanese military rules in 1944 were absolutely clear about one thing: capture was not an option, ever. The Senjinkan, the military code every imperial soldier carried, stated it plainly: do not live to experience shame as a prisoner. Officers were given cyanide capsules to carry at all times, and regular soldiers were trained to use grenades on themselves rather than surrender to the enemy. The very idea of surrendering was so foreign, so unthinkable in Japanese military culture, that even the word for it, kozen, carried with it the weight of ultimate disgrace and dishonor. For Japanese women serving in uniform, the situation was even more terrifying because military propaganda had convinced them beyond any doubt that American soldiers were savage barbarians who raped and murdered female prisoners without showing any mercy whatsoever. These fears weren't just random worries. They were carefully constructed psychological weapons designed specifically to prevent anyone from surrendering and to make sure soldiers would fight to the death no matter what. Japanese newsreels showed doctored footage of American atrocities that never actually happened, while radio broadcasts described completely invented massacres in graphic detail, and officers repeated these horrifying stories over and over until everyone accepted them as absolute truth. By March 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into the mountainous Baguio region, the Japanese defensive lines completely collapsed and fell apart. Most of the Japanese troops retreated higher into the mountains to continue fighting as guerrillas, but approximately 24 women, nurses from a field hospital, 3 communications officers, and several administrative staff members, found themselves completely cut off from the main Japanese force with no way to reach them. For 3 long weeks, these women hid in abandoned buildings and dark caves, surviving on whatever roots they could dig up and drinking contaminated water that made them sick. Sergeant Michiko Tanaka, who was 31 years old and had worked as a surgical nurse in Manchuria before being sent to the Philippines, kept a diary throughout her ordeal, and fragments of it somehow survived the war. On March 28th, she wrote these heartbreaking words, "We have no food left, no medicine. Fumiko is burning up with fever. At night, we can hear American patrols passing nearby in the darkness. Each night, I think tomorrow they will find us. Tomorrow it all ends." Their capture, when it finally came, didn't happen with violence or drama. It happened simply because they were too exhausted and sick to keep hiding anymore. An American patrol discovered the women huddled together in a collapsed warehouse on the outskirts of Baguio City. Private First Class Robert Chun, a Nisei soldier serving as the patrol's interpreter, was there when it happened, and his account, recorded years later in a 1982 oral history interview, describes exactly what he saw. They were pressed into the corner, huddled together like frightened animals. Their uniforms were torn and filthy. Some of them didn't even have shoes anymore. When they saw us walking toward them, they didn't try to run or fight. They just closed their eyes and started praying. I thought at first they were praying for mercy, begging us not to hurt them. Later, I realized they were actually praying for death, asking for it to be quick. The women were loaded onto trucks and transported to a temporary detention compound set up outside the city. It wasn't anything like a traditional prisoner of war camp because American forces were advancing so rapidly that there wasn't time to build permanent facilities. It was simply a guarded area. Just a few canvas tents, a water source, and open ground. The women were given a space to sleep and minimal rations consisting of rice porridge served twice daily, occasionally supplemented with some dried fish. The American guards, mostly young infantrymen from the 33rd Division, had received absolutely no training in how to handle female prisoners because most of them had never even seen a Japanese woman in uniform before this moment. Their standing orders were straightforward and simple. Secure the perimeter, prevent anyone from escaping, and maintain basic humanitarian standards as outlined in the Geneva Convention. But those standing orders didn't say anything at all about what to do when prisoners completely refused to eat because they were convinced the food had been poisoned. For the entire first week, the women barely touched any of the rations they were given because they were absolutely certain the Americans were fattening them up before the real torture would begin. Nurse Fumiko Sato, who was 26 years old, later recalled through an interpreter, "We thought they were playing with us the way cats play with mice before killing them. We waited each day for the game to end and the violence to start." Malnutrition and disease spread quickly through the compound. Several of the women developed dysentery, and Fumiko's fever grew worse and worse until it turned into full pneumonia. Lieutenant Yoshiko Nakamura, the highest-ranking officer among the prisoners, tried desperately to maintain military discipline and order, but it felt completely absurd. They weren't really soldiers anymore. They were just ghosts waiting to fade away into nothing. The compound itself represented such a strange contrast. Outside the wire fence, American supply trucks rumbled past constantly, carrying ammunition and food supplies to frontline units still fighting in the mountains. While inside the fence, 24 women existed in this suspended state between life and death, clinging to the only certainty they'd ever been taught, which was that Americans showed absolutely no mercy to their enemies. Then came April 12th, the day when everything changed completely. Captain William Morrison, a 34-year-old man who'd been a high school history teacher in Portland before the war started, had landed at Leyte Gulf back in October and fought his way north through some of the bloodiest, most brutal combat anyone had seen in the entire Pacific theater. He'd watched men die in ways that would haunt him for the rest of his life, and he'd learned to compartmentalize his feelings, to see the enemy as just the enemy and nothing more. But when he visited the detention compound that morning as part of a routine inspection tour, what he saw there broke through all of those carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart. These weren't enemy soldiers standing before him. They were starving, terrified women who looked like they'd already died inside, just waiting for their bodies to catch up. Morrison's interpreter, Private Chun, carefully explained the situation to him. The women believed with absolute certainty that they were being held specifically for execution. They thought the small rations they received were a deliberate form of cruelty, and they fully expected torture to begin at any moment. Morrison stood there in the morning sunlight, looking at 24 human beings who'd been so thoroughly dehumanized by their own government's propaganda that they literally couldn't recognize an act of mercy when it was right in front of them. And in that moment, he made a decision that wasn't written in any military manual or handbook. He turned to his supply sergeant and said firmly, "Get me breakfast, real breakfast, everything we've got in storage." Within just 1 hour, soldiers returned carrying wooden crates from the division supply depot, and the smell hit the compound first. A smell these women hadn't experienced in months and months. Fresh baked bread, canned meat, fruit cocktail and syrup, hot coffee, chocolate bars wrapped in foil. The American soldiers opened the crates right there in the center of the compound where everyone could see. Corporal James Rodriguez, 22 years old, watched the women's faces carefully as the food was revealed, and he later wrote these words to his sister back home. They just stared at the food like they couldn't believe what they were seeing with their own eyes. One of them started crying, then another woman joined her, and soon every single one of them was crying. "I've never seen anything like it in my entire life." Sergeant Michiko was the first one brave enough to move toward the crates. She stood up slowly, walked carefully across the compound, and picked up a can of corned beef with shaking hands. She examined it closely, turned it over and over in her palms, then looked directly at Captain Morrison with questioning eyes. She said something in Japanese, and Private Chun translated her words. "She's asking if the food is poisoned." Morrison took the can gently from her hands, opened it with his pocket knife, and ate a forkful of the meat himself right there in front of everyone. Then he handed the can back to her and said clearly, "Tell her it's real food. Tell her they're not going to die today." That's when the dam finally broke. The women surged forward toward the crates, though not frantically or desperately, but carefully, almost reverently. They took food slowly and deliberately, as if it might suddenly vanish into thin air if they moved too quickly. Some women sat down right there on the ground and started eating immediately, while others brought food back to the sick women who were too weak to stand up on their own. Private Yuki Harada, only 19 years old and the youngest member of the group, picked up a chocolate bar and held it in both hands like it was some kind of sacred religious object. She later said through an interpreter, "I genuinely thought I was dreaming, that I had actually died and this was some kind of strange afterlife. I absolutely could not understand why our enemies were feeding us instead of killing us." But providing food was really only the beginning of what Captain Morrison had planned. Over the next 3 days, he requisitioned medical supplies from the division, and an army medic came to examine Fumiko carefully and immediately started her on sulfa drugs to treat her worsening pneumonia. Canvas cots replaced the cold, muddy ground where they'd been sleeping, and a water purification unit was brought in to provide clean, safe drinking water for everyone. The compound transformed almost overnight from a simple holding area into something that actually resembled a proper prisoner of war facility. The change in the women themselves was gradual but unmistakably visible. They began eating regularly without fear, and slowly but surely, color returned to their hollow faces, and the constant tension that had gripped every moment in the compound began to ease and fade away. But the psychological transformation took much longer and was far more complicated. Lieutenant Yoshiko struggled with it more than anyone else because she'd been trained as an officer, conditioned her entire life to lead others, to maintain strict discipline, to uphold the emperor's honor above everything else. But what did honor even mean anymore when your supposed enemy was the one feeding you and treating your wounds? What was discipline worth when your own military had abandoned you completely and left you to die? She'd spent 3 full years believing with her whole heart that Americans were literal monsters, inhuman creatures. Yet now those same monsters were carefully bandaging her injuries and patiently teaching her simple English words with genuine kindness. The American soldiers faced their own set of contradictions and confusion too. These were enemy soldiers sitting in front of them, Japanese soldiers, members of the same military that had bombed Pearl Harbor without warning and committed terrible atrocities all across Asia, the same military force that had killed their close friends in brutal battles from Guadalcanal to Okinawa and everywhere in between. Yet here they were now, sharing their cigarettes and chocolate rations, teaching the women card games to pass the time, showing them photographs of their families back home in America. Corporal Rodriguez found himself one afternoon in a deep philosophical debate with another soldier, Private Eddie Walsh, who said with genuine confusion, "I still don't get it at all. We're supposed to kill these people on the battlefield, shoot them on sight, but here in this compound we're supposed to be nice and kind to them? Where exactly is the line? How do we know which is right?" Rodriguez thought about the question for a long moment before responding, "Maybe there isn't actually a line at all. Maybe that's the whole point we're supposed to understand." By the end of April, something truly extraordinary had developed within the small compound. Not quite friendship, because the gulf between them was still far too wide for that, but something even more significant and meaningful. Recognition, pure and simple. Recognition that the enemy was fundamentally human just like them, and recognition that humanity could somehow persist and survive even when absolutely everything else had failed and fallen apart. The Japanese women began teaching the American guards basic Japanese phrases for everyday things, and the Americans taught them English words in return, and they started sharing stories with each other, carefully at first, testing the waters, then more and more openly as trust slowly built. Sergeant Michiko, drawing on her experience as a trained nurse, began consulting with the American medics about the best ways to treat the sick women in the compound, and her medical knowledge was genuinely respected and valued by everyone. Lieutenant Yoshiko found herself having practical discussions with Captain Morrison about logistics, where to dig the latrines, how to organize the sleeping area more efficiently, practical everyday matters that required no ideology or politics at all, only basic common sense and cooperation. One afternoon in early May, a sudden tropical downpour sent everyone scrambling desperately for shelter from the pounding rain, and Private Yuki ended up pressed under a canvas tarp with 3 American soldiers, complete strangers just moments before. They sat there together watching the rain come down in sheets, and someone passed around a pack of Lucky Strike cigarettes, and for about 20 minutes they were just people sheltering from a storm together, nothing more and nothing less. When the rain finally stopped and the sun broke through the clouds again, Yuki looked at the American soldiers beside her and said in her halting, carefully practiced English, "Same rain, same sky." One of the soldiers, Private Danny O'Brien, nodded slowly and said simply, "Yeah, same rain." It was such a small moment, so easily forgotten in the chaos of everything else happening, but it represented something absolutely monumental. A crack in the absolute certainties that war demanded from everyone, a brief glimpse of the world as it actually was, not as propaganda and hatred had painted it to be. By late May 1945, the war in the Philippines was effectively finished. The Japanese defensive positions had completely collapsed and crumbled, and the surviving Japanese forces were scattered throughout the mountains, completely cut off from any supply lines or command structure that could help them. On May 8th, Germany surrendered thousands of miles away in Europe, though the news took several days to reach these remote Philippine compounds where time seemed to move differently. The Pacific War was still continuing, grinding forward relentlessly, but everyone could sense deep in their bones that it was entering its final phase, that the end was coming soon whether anyone was ready for it or not. Captain Morrison received official orders to transfer the women prisoners to a much larger prisoner of war facility located in Manila, which meant the small compound would be completely dismantled and taken down. The American soldiers would move north to their next assignment, and the brief, strange community that had somehow formed in this unlikely place would dissolve and disappear forever. The night before the transfer was scheduled to happen, Morrison gathered all the women together and explained through Private Chun, speaking slowly so everyone could understand exactly what would happen next. They would be transported to Manila, where the facilities were much better. They would receive proper medical care from trained doctors, and eventually, when the war finally ended, they would be sent home and repatriated back to Japan. The women listened to his words in complete silence, absorbing everything, and finally Sergeant Michiko spoke up, her voice quiet but clear, and Private Chun translated her question. "She's asking if you'll be there in Manila with us." Morrison shook his head gently and said, "No, my unit is moving out in a different direction. We won't see each other again." Michiko nodded slowly, understanding washing over her face, and then she bowed formally and deeply, a gesture filled with meaning, and one by one, all the other women followed her lead and bowed as well. It wasn't a gesture of submission or defeat. It was a gesture of profound respect, of genuine gratitude, of recognition for what these men had done for them. Morrison, clearly uncomfortable with the formality of the moment, returned the bow awkwardly, not quite sure what to do with his hands, and said quietly, "You deserve to be treated like human beings. I'm just glad we could do at least that much." The next morning arrived too quickly, and trucks rumbled into the compound to transport the women to Manila. And as they prepared to leave, gathering their few belongings, each woman took time to say goodbye personally to the soldiers they'd come to know over these strange weeks. Lieutenant Yoshiko walked up to Captain Morrison and shook his hand firmly, looking him directly in the eyes, and said in careful, practiced English, "You showed us something important. You showed us that everything we were told was wrong." Morrison nodded, feeling the weight of her words, and replied, "Maybe that's the real victory in all of this. Learning that the enemy is just people trying to survive, same as us." The women arrived in Manila on May 12th and were processed into a much larger prisoner of war facility that housed several hundred Japanese prisoners, both military personnel and civilians caught up in the war. The facility was definitely better equipped than the small compound. It had proper wooden barracks, a fully staffed infirmary with real medical equipment, organized mess halls with regular meal times, everything you'd expect from an established camp. But something precious was lost in that transition from the intimate compound to this institutional setting. The daily personal interactions that had slowly humanized both sides, the casual conversations that built understanding, all of that was replaced by rigid institutional routine and formal procedures. The psychological aftermath of everything they'd experienced began to surface slowly, revealing itself in unexpected ways. Nurse Fumiko, her pneumonia finally cured thanks to American medicine, found herself struggling with terrible nightmares that woke her up in the middle of the night, her heart pounding with fear. She would dream that she was back in the compound, but in these dreams, the Americans were exactly as monstrous as the propaganda had always promised they would be: cruel, violent, inhuman. She would wake up drenched in sweat, completely confused, genuinely unsure which reality was actually true anymore, unable to reconcile what she'd been taught with what she'd actually experienced. An army psychologist named Captain Eleanor Hayes, one of the few female officers working with the prisoners, noted carefully in her official report, "Many of the female Japanese prisoners of war exhibit clear symptoms of severe cognitive dissonance. Their recent experience completely contradicts everything their military training had conditioned them to believe about the enemy. They're struggling to rebuild their understanding of the world from scratch." Lieutenant Yoshiko faced a completely different kind of crisis, a crisis of identity that cut to her very core. She'd defined herself her entire adult life as an officer of the Imperial Japanese Army, had built her whole sense of self around that role, but what did any of that mean now in this strange new reality? Her army had abandoned her without a second thought, left her to die alone in the mountains. Her country was clearly losing the war, crumbling under the weight of American military power. And most confusing of all, the enemy she'd been taught to hate had shown her more genuine honor and human decency than her own commanders ever had. She spent hours and hours in the facility's small library, reading whatever books were available in Japanese, desperately trying to reconstruct some kind of sense of self, trying to figure out who she was if she wasn't the person she'd always believed herself to be. Private Yuki, the youngest of the group at barely 19 years old, seemed to adapt most easily to the new situation, perhaps because she was less rigid, less conditioned by years of military indoctrination than the older women. She quickly befriended some of the civilian women prisoners, Japanese families who'd been living in the Philippines when the war broke out, and she continued learning more and more English, studying it seriously, and she even started teaching basic Japanese to some of the American nurses who worked at the facility, building bridges where she could. She was actively building something new and hopeful from the ruins of what had been destroyed. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled over radio speakers throughout the facility, thin and distant, announcing Japan's unconditional surrender to the Allied forces. The war was finally, officially over after so many years of death and destruction. In the Manila prisoner of war facility, the news brought a complicated mixture of relief, grief, and profound confusion all swirling together. For many Japanese prisoners, surrender was still completely unthinkable, fundamentally incompatible with everything they believed. Some adamantly refused to believe the broadcast was real, insisting it must be American propaganda. Others wept openly and uncontrollably, though they couldn't fully articulate whether they were crying for their defeated nation, for lost comrades, or simply from overwhelming relief that the killing had finally stopped. Sergeant Michiko stood listening to the Emperor's voice, tears streaming down her face, though she wasn't entirely sure why she was crying. Was it defeat? Was it relief? Was it grief for all the wasted years? She found herself thinking about Captain Morrison and those American soldiers who'd fed her when she'd been expecting nothing but death, and she realized something profound. They'd won far more than just the war. They'd proven beyond any doubt that even in the midst of complete chaos and violence, basic humanity could somehow survive and flourish. The repatriation process took many long months filled with paperwork and waiting and uncertainty. The women from the Baguio compound waited together in Manila, writing careful letters home to families they hadn't seen in years, deeply unsure what truths they could safely share, what experiences they could admit to without bringing shame on themselves or their families. In November, they were finally placed on a United States Navy transport ship bound for Japan, heading home at last. As Lieutenant Yoshiko slowly climbed the gangway to board, Captain Hayes, the psychologist who'd been working with them, asked her one final question. "What will you tell people back home about what happened to you?" Yoshiko paused on the gangway, thinking carefully, then said with quiet conviction, "I'll tell them the truth, that the enemy taught me more about real honor and human decency than my own commanders ever did." 12 days later, the transport ship docked at Uraga Harbor, and the women stepped onto Japanese soil for the first time in years. But the Japan they returned to bore almost no resemblance to the country they'd left behind. Cities lay in smoking ruins, entire neighborhoods burned to ashes, people were literally starving in the streets, and hope seemed impossibly thin on the ground. Returning home turned out to be harder in many ways than captivity had ever been, filled with questions they couldn't answer and judgments they couldn't escape. Michiko made her way back to her village near Hiroshima and found it half destroyed by the atomic bomb. Buildings flattened, but miraculously, her family had survived somehow. Her elderly mother, seeing how much her daughter had changed, urged her strongly to stay silent about the war years, to never speak of what had happened. But Michiko discovered she simply couldn't stay silent anymore. She'd seen too much, learned too much. She found work in a small medical clinic, and when patients asked her questions, she would tell them stories about the American captain who'd brought breakfast to starving prisoners, and some people doubted her story completely, calling her a liar or worse, but one old doctor who listened carefully said something she never forgot. "Maybe that's exactly how we rebuild this broken country, not with weapons and hatred, but with empathy and understanding." Lieutenant Yoshiko eventually reunited with her husband, a naval officer who'd survived the war by pure luck, and their first conversations together were painfully difficult and awkward. He'd spent years fighting Americans on the open sea while she'd learned to see those same Americans as complex human beings capable of kindness. Slowly, carefully, they found common ground in their shared exhaustion and their deep desire for peace, building their relationship again from scratch. Private Yuki, still only 20 years old, struggled perhaps most of all because she'd known nothing but war her entire adult life, had never experienced peacetime as a grown woman. Yet somehow she managed to find purpose teaching English in the port city of Yokohama, using the language she'd learned from her former enemies. When curious students asked her where she'd learned to speak English so well, she would answer simply and honestly, "From the enemy. They taught me that enemies can become teachers if we're willing to listen." In 1947, 15 of the original 24 women from the Baguio compound managed to reunite in Tokyo, coming from different cities and different lives to share one modest meal together. They raised their cups in a toast to everything they'd survived, and Lieutenant Yoshiko said formally, "To survival, to making it through when we thought we wouldn't." Nurse Fumiko added quietly, "To the men who showed us that survival could be honorable, that mercy was real." Young Yuki whispered, "To second chances, to being allowed to start over." And Sergeant Michiko said simply, her voice thick with emotion, "To remembering, so we never, ever forget what humanity looks like even in the middle of war, even when everything else tells us to abandon it." The reunions grew smaller and less frequent as the years passed and life pulled them in different directions, but the memories never faded completely. In 1982, a Japanese-American historian named Thomas Nakamura tracked down Michiko, now 73 years old and living quietly, to interview her about her war experiences. She showed him her old diary, its pages yellowed and fragile, and pointed to one specific entry that she'd read 1,000 times. "The Americans brought us food today, real food. How do we make sense of enemies who feed us instead of killing us?" She looked at the historian with eyes that had seen more than most people could imagine and said with absolute conviction, "The worst lies that war tells us are the ones that make us see other human beings as less than human, as monsters instead of people." Captain Morrison never talked much about the Baguio compound when he returned home to Portland after the war ended. There were no medals awarded for giving prisoners breakfast, no newspaper headlines celebrating small acts of human decency, no parades for showing basic compassion. He went back to teaching high school history, and when he died peacefully in 1989, his family found a single photograph tucked into his war journal, a blurry image of a compound in the Philippines with some tents and a fence, nothing remarkable at all to look at. On the back, in his careful handwriting, he'd written just a few words. "We gave them breakfast. That's all. Just breakfast." Years later, a small memorial stone was placed in a quiet corner of Tokyo, inscribed with the names of all 24 women from the Baguio compound. A simple reminder that their story had happened, that it was real, that in April 1945, 24 women who'd been taught to hate discovered that their enemies were human beings capable of extraordinary kindness, and that single discovery changed everything they thought they knew about the world.